Hello, and welcome back to the History of Egypt podcast, episode 240, Merneptah versus the Sea Peoples, and Odysseus, and the Hittites. In the summer of 1221 BCE, the banks of the Nile River were stained with blood. Corpses floated in waterways, weapons, splattered with gore, lay amid reeds and rushes. Across a battlefield in the western delta, Egyptian soldiers gathered corpses of their enemies. They hacked off limbs, stripped armor, and collected valuables. Nearby, piles of ash marked the smoking remains of a vast encampment. Tents burned to the ground, trampled underfoot, and buried in the dust. Pharaoh's victorious arm, or Nekhet-Aya, had smote their foe, a vast coalition of tribes from the western highlands. The leaders were dead, many of them pierced on stakes and lining the western roads. Now, other soldiers gathered captives. They bound the arms of men, women, and children, and wrangled thousands of animals, goats, cattle, and donkeys. Merneptah tells us the fate of these people. Quote, "The enemy whom I force to know me is in my hand or possession. I make the survivors fill the temples. Great is the slaughter made among their leaders. All goes well with Kemet." It seems that Merneptah took the Libu survivors as slaves. Thousands of prisoners would go to work, sowing and harvesting crops, manufacturing items, and serving the needs of the royal and divine economy. If all went well, the next few generations of Libu would marry and integrate with the wider Egyptian society. They would cease to be a threat and become Egyptians in every legal sense. Ironically, that was kind of their intention to begin with. From Merneptah's texts, the Libu invasion really sounds more like a migration, armed to be sure, but coming with families and animals, intending to settle rather than conquer. So why would the Egyptians defeat such a movement, then turn around and give them a form of that settlement? Well, as with most matters related to migration, the real issue was control. Control of the borders, settlement zones, and most importantly, the farmland. The Libu had come in force, many thousands strong, with warlords and allies to help. Such a sudden influx might devastate the northern farmlands and consume resources. Merneptah alluded to that in his account of the war, saying that the enemy, quote, "spend their day wandering to fill their bellies. To seek the necessities of their mouths do they come to the land of Kemet." In other words, the Egyptians were worried that the Libu would take their stuff, consuming the things they were producing in a densely populated region. By contrast, we do have records of other groups migrating to Egypt successfully. A few years after this battle, scribes in the eastern delta recorded a Shasu, or Bedouin tribe, moving into the region. Royal officials reported, quote, "We have finished allowing the Shasu tribes to pass the fortress of Merneptah in order to sustain them and their flocks. Through the good pleasure of Pharaoh, life, prosperity, health." We can safely assume that this tribe was much smaller than the Libu host and probably not heavily armed. They had apparently sought permission to graze their herds in the eastern delta. Pharaoh or his representatives gave it, and the tribe moved in unmolested. It illustrates the duality of Egyptian frontier policy. They had no problem with migration as a concept, and it had happened for centuries, but they wanted to control it. The dust and smoke settled over the western battlefield, and Egyptian warriors took thousands of Libu into captivity. But the northern business was not finished yet. Throughout his war narratives, Merneptah mentions another enemy, 5 of them, associated with the Libu tribes, perhaps allied to them, but not themselves Libyans. These 5 groups were named Sherden, or Shardana, Shekelesh, Ekwesh, or Akawasha, Tursha, or Teresh, and Lukka. Merneptah referred to these as coming, quote, "Na chasut en pa'im," or "from the foreign lands of the sea." That is, groups commonly known as Sea Peoples. Who were they? Sea peoples is an umbrella term describing several tribes that moved through the eastern Mediterranean during the 13th and 12th centuries. They were not a single migrating horde, but the Egyptians occasionally battled one or multiple groups in their northern territories. We've encountered two of these previously in the Amarna period and the early reign of Ramesses II. Now it was Merneptah's turn. According to his grand war narratives, King Merneptah defeated these people from the sea in regnal year 5. At least one of them, the Shekelesh, are described as allies of the Libu tribes, invading from the west. The other 4 are slightly vague. The hieroglyph texts are damaged, with lengthy gaps in the record. At Karnak, for example, we are missing about 1/3 of the lines. Unfortunately, a lot of that 1/3 was the introduction, setting the scene and giving the context. And because irony is a jerk, many of the Sea People's references likely appeared in those opening lines. As a result, scholars are slightly divided on how many of these tribes were involved in the war and what they actually did. The traditional view is to see the Libu and Sea Peoples as one united force. More recently, scholars like Samer Iskander, who produced a PhD thesis on Merneptah's reign, suggest that the situation was actually quite different. Studying the texts in detail, Iskander wonders if the Sea Peoples were already present in the delta when the war began, and Merneptah simply conflated multiple groups to make a tidy narrative. Unfortunately, the texts are too damaged to say confidently one way or the other. But while their role may be slightly uncertain, the presence of these Sea Peoples is beyond doubt. So let's meet them. First up, we have the Sherden. They are the best known of all the Sea People groups, and they're also the oldest. The Sherden had been present and recorded in the eastern Mediterranean for more than 100 years before Merneptah's reign. During the Amarna period, around 1370, they had been active in Canaan and Syria, mostly individuals, not tribes, but mentioned by local kings. More recently, Ramesses II had battled the, quote, Sherden of rebellious hearts, who came boldly in their ships of fighting. Ramesses proclaimed that he, quote, plundered them, they being carried off to Kemet. And as a result, the Sherden entered service in Egypt's royal army. Sherden warriors fought alongside Ramesses at the Battle of Kadesh, and they turn up in his art and texts as a kind of bodyguard. Now, Merneptah also defeated such raiders. It's unclear how many Sherden had come. The hieroglyphs are damaged. There were at least 10, but that could be 110, 1010, 5010. We can't be certain. The origins of the Sherden remain debated. Based purely on their name, scholars have argued that they might come from western Anatolia, the region of Sardis, or perhaps the Ionian coast, Sardonia, or they may have come from far to the west, around the island of Sardinia. Others have proposed a Semitic or Hurrian origin, that is, Syria and northern Mesopotamia. Unfortunately, most interpretations are based on either the name or visual elements of their costumes, like the shape of their swords, but nothing truly tangible or physical has yet come to light. The best we can say is they probably came from the eastern Mediterranean, maybe from the west. Like his father, Merneptah may have recruited these Sherden after their defeat. Later in his reign, another text references the, quote, Sherden whom you carried off through your strong arm, who have plundered the foreign hill countries. That might be rhetoric or a callback to his father, but it's plausible that Merneptah recruited the Sherden to join his royal army. Second, we have the Lukka. They are also well documented in the eastern Mediterranean. Hittite records mention the Lukka frequently, and they seem to have lived in the southwest of Anatolia. They didn't have a kingdom or a centralized state, but they were a menace. The Hittites waged war against them and subjugated them occasionally, but the Lukka always broke away and went back to fighting. At some point, the Lukka turned to piracy, going forth on ships and attacking vulnerable coasts. Our best record of this comes from the days of Akhenaten, about 140 years before Merneptah. Back then, the king of Cyprus wrote a letter to Pharaoh, speaking of Lukki raiders. He complained how, quote, "Every year, year after year, men of the Lukki seize villages in my country." The problem persisted for decades. Messages passing between Syria and Hatti talk about the Lukka repeatedly, always as a nuisance or a threat. Now, at last, the Lukka were reaching Egypt. Because of the damage to Merneptah's texts, we don't know how many Lukka came to the Nile. In one part, the tribal name is lost, but the number is 2,362 men. If that was the Lukka, they might have been a sizable force indeed. On this occasion, the Lukka were defeated, but they'd be back before too long. And later, these Anatolian peoples entered myth as the Lycians. They show up in the epic poems, particularly those of the Trojan War, where they fought alongside the Trojans against the Greeks. That is myth, but if it has any historical basis at all, it's kind of intriguing. You see, according to Merneptah's records, the Lukka attacking Egypt were actually allied with a group who might be Greeks. Let's meet the Ekwesh. After the Lukka and Sherden, Merneptah speaks of Akawasha, or Ekwesh. They are an intriguing bunch. Broadly speaking, scholars seem to agree that the Ekwesh might be the Egyptian version of Achaeans, that is, Greeks. In the Iliad and Odyssey, the poet Homer uses the term Achaean as one of the many synonyms for the Greek peoples. Today, scholars use the broader culture term Mycenaeans. They probably originated on the mainland, maybe the Peloponnesian Peninsula. Eventually, the Achaeans or Mycenaeans spread east across the Aegean and established communities in western Anatolia. They are visible archaeologically, particularly through pottery of Aegean style that shows up at certain sites. More dramatically, the Achaeans turn up in the Hittite records, where they are called the Achiawans. Hittite records speak of conflicts sparked by a king of Achiawa. Whether that was an Achaean kingdom in Anatolia or expeditions coming across the sea remains a matter of debate. The point is, these Achaeans were well established in the Aegean by the time Merneptah came to power. Which begs the question, if they were doing so well overseas, why come all the way to Egypt? Here we have two possible explanations. Achaean warriors might have joined the Libu invasion because raiding was their game. We get hints of this in the epic poems. In the Odyssey, for example, Homer describes Achaeans sailing the seas as raiders or pirates. Odysseus himself claims to have led 9 such raids, even before the Trojan War. More on that later. But that's legend. How about history? While archaeology may give some answers, the late 13th century was a difficult time in Greece. Between 1250 and 1200, around the time of Merneptah, multiple sites in mainland Greece experienced moments of destruction. The great palaces at Mycenae, Tiryns, and even Thebes, the Greek Thebes, not the Egyptian, fell in fire and wreckage. The destruction was not total, life still continued, but damage like that might prompt some groups to go forth on the sea. Perhaps they went to raid, seeking new wealth, or to find comfortable new homes. All of that, unfortunately, is still speculative. There are a ton of questions about this phase of Aegean history, and scholars have not reached any consensus over the causes of the damage or the outcomes. The best we can say is that the mid-13th century was an unsettled time in that region. Perhaps some warriors were drawn to the sea, and ultimately to Egypt, in search of opportunity. Next, we have the Tursha, or Teresh. Of the 5 groups, they were the second smallest in number. Merneptah's warriors cut off 790 Tursha hands. It's unclear how many survivors went into captivity, but the group seems to have been relatively small. The origins of the Tursha are perhaps the most uncertain. Possibly Anatolian, they might come from the region around Troy, another area later known as Lydia, or the city of Tarsus on the south coast, not far from Syria. Again, it's terribly uncertain and largely based on the name. Even worse, the Tursha are only documented in the Egyptian records, nothing from Hatti or from Syria. Of all the peoples Merneptah mentions, these Tursha are the most poorly documented and the most mysterious. Finally, we have the Shekelesh. Now these were sea peoples in the most literal sense. Like the others, they'd been kicking around the eastern Mediterranean for at least a few decades before showing up in Egypt. The best references come from the city of Ugarit in Syria. A Hittite letter found at Ugarit describes the Shekelesh as, quote, those who live on ships. Apparently this group were seaborne much of the time, and the landlubbers found it worthy of comment. Alas, the origins of these people are also unclear. Scholars have proposed regions like Anatolia, specifically an area called Sagalassos, or perhaps even Sicily, but as usual, these are based on the name. To date, archaeological evidence for the Shekelesh is practically non-existent. Perhaps an Anatolian origin is the most likely, given the other groups coming to Egypt, but still, it's open to debate. Following their defeat in the Delta, Merneptah claimed 250 Shekelesh hands. They were the smallest number out of all the enemy lists. Perhaps most of the Shekelesh were taken prisoner, or this was just a tiny group traveling with the larger coalition. At any rate, they too would disappear onto Egyptian farms and service at temples. As you can see, evidence for these sea peoples, quote-unquote, varies wildly. Some tribes are well documented across multiple regions and decades. Others are barely a blip in the historical record. For scholars, some questions remain unanswerable on current evidence. The origin of these groups is the biggest problem. Beyond a couple of them, like the Lukka and Ekwesh, the foreigners are so vaguely defined that locating them geographically is hazardous at best. Hopefully, future excavations will uncover new evidence, and if it does, I'll come back and flesh out their tale. For now, the best we can say is that in 1221 BCE, 5 groups from across the sea came to Egypt in conjunction with the Libu tribes. They were defeated, many of them killed, and the rest taken as slaves, or perhaps recruited as soldiers. If that was the end of their story, that would be terribly unsatisfactory. Fortunately, it's not. Just a few decades after Merneptah, the sea peoples would be back, and in greater numbers. In fact, they were going to appear on Egypt's shores in one of the greatest battles in Bronze Age history. In the process, the Egyptians who experienced that conflict also produced some of the most elaborate art depicting these groups, including their ships and their weapons, allowing greater and more detailed study. But that is a tale for the near future. I have a bit more to say about the Aegean, Anatolia, and the larger context of this conflict. Before that, though, let's quickly circle back to an epic question: how the sea peoples might line up with the Achaean raiders found in the poems of Homer, specifically the Odyssey. The tale of Odysseus, as recounted by Homer, is mythology, but aspects of the narrative and stories that Odysseus himself tells may draw on cultural memories that had persisted over centuries. One key example comes in Book 14 of the Odyssey, in which the king of Ithaca describes, allegedly, going forth as a raider. To set the scene, Odysseus has returned to his kingdom. He hasn't revealed himself yet, or slaughtered the obnoxious suitors. First, he stops at the house of Eumaeus, the swineherd, and receives his hospitality. Eumaeus does not recognize his king, yet, and inquires the stranger's origins. To conceal his identity a bit longer, Odysseus fabricates a tale. It begins, quote, Odysseus said cunningly, I come from spacious Crete. I have the gift of courage from Athena and from Ares. I did not like farm work or housekeeping or raising children. I liked sailing better, and war with spears and arrows, deadly weapons. Others may shudder at such things, but gods made my heart love them. People's preferences are different. Before the Greeks went off to march on Troy, I led my troops and fleet on 9 forays with great success. I had my pick of all the spoils. Soon my house grew rich. I was a fine, important man among the Cretans. End quote. Odysseus paints a picture of Achaean or Greek raiders sailing forth repeatedly to plunder distant lands. Even before the war at Troy, he claims to have been a successful pirate and built the wealth of his house upon such efforts. Odysseus carries on describing the Trojan War, which he laments as a, quote, expedition of disaster. In the aftermath, Odysseus claims to have returned to Crete, his fictional home, but he found domesticity unsatisfactory. Soon, he yearned to go forth once more. Here, we get to the crux of it. Quote, some impulse made me want to sail to Egypt, with 9 ships and a godlike crew. I rushed to get the fleet prepared and gather up the men. We feasted 6 days, and then on the 7th we embarked, and sailed from Crete. A fair north wind was blowing, so we could drift on easily, like floating downstream. In 5 days we had reached the river valley of Egypt. My fleet docked inside the Nile. Logically, if Odysseus was coming from Crete, they would have sailed southward to the North African coast, and then travelled along until reaching one of the Nile branches. This might have been the Canopic or Rosetta branch, from which they could proceed upriver into the western delta. So far, it's remarkably similar to Merneptah's tale of the Libu and the Sea Peoples. Odysseus continues, quote, I told the loyal men to wait and guard the ships while I sent scouts to check around from points of higher ground. But they indulged their own aggressive impulses and started willfully doing damage to the fields of Egypt and enslaved the little children and women, and they killed the men. The news soon reached the city. People heard the screaming, and right away at dawn they all arrived. The plain was filled with warriors on foot, and chariots and gleaming bronze. And Zeus, lord of lightning, caused my men to panic. They dared not keep on fighting. Danger lurked on every side. Then many of my men were killed with sharp bronze spears. The rest were taken as slaves to work for them. I wish I too had died in Egypt, but more pain remained. Zeus put another plan into my mind. I took my helmet off my head and dropped my shield and sword, and unarmed I approached the king. Beside his chariot I grasped his knees and kissed them. He was merciful. He kept me safe and took me home with him, riding his chariot. My eyes were wet. Many Egyptians were enraged with me and tried to kill me with their spears. The king protected me. He feared the wrath of Zeus, the god of strangers who hates wickedness. I stayed there 7 years and gained great wealth. All the Egyptian people gave me gifts. End quote. Odysseus' attack, though fictional, contains story elements that seem remarkably familiar. Ships sailing up the Nile, a battle outside of a city, defeat by the Egyptian army, and warriors taken into captivity. The tale bears more than a passing resemblance to the events described by Merneptah, and also by one of his successors. It seems plausible, at least, that some vague cultural memory of these events persisted in later Greek society. The idea has kicked around for a while that such tales may have their genesis in the late Bronze Age collapse. Today, scholars like Geoffrey Emanuel are the most active proponents of such interpretations, suggesting that Odysseus' Cretan lie is a distant descendant of the 13th and 12th century phenomena. That is all slightly ahead of our current history, but it's fun to see the parallels between events in Merneptah's reign, and others a bit later, and stories told by the bards of a future age. Maybe, like the Exodus for the Hebrews, Greeks of Homer's time had a shared memory of captivity in Egypt. Anyway, enough mythology. Let's wrap up our story with one last bit of history. Back in the reign of Ramesses II, the old pharaoh announced that, quote, "He, the king, has destroyed the warriors of the Great Green, or Mediterranean. The Delta land slumbers and can rest." Now, 7 decades later, violence had returned to Egypt's northern realm. Merneptah raged against the Sherden, Lukka, Ekwesh, Shekelesh, and Tursha. Alongside the Libu tribes, northern warriors, and maybe families, fell to Egyptian blades, and many more disappeared into captivity. Okay, that's all well and good. But why was this happening? What brought these groups to Egypt in the first place? In the short term, individual groups, like the Sherden or the Shekelesh, may have gone to sea because of hardship at home. Outside of mainland Greece, possible home of the Ekwesh, other parts of the eastern Mediterranean were experiencing hard times. Archaeologists have determined that a drought began in this part of the world around 1250 BCE and lasted approximately 100 years. Written evidence for that hardship appears in Syria and, most notably, in Hatti. Throughout this period, the Hittites suffered food shortages, eventually turning to Egypt for imports. So there was some terrible climate disruption sweeping this region. Perhaps folks like the Ekwesh or Lukka went in search of more fertile lands. On the human level, there is also abundant evidence for conflict. In Anatolia, for example, the Hittites regularly waged war against rebels and enemy kingdoms. In the late 13th century, around the time of Merneptah, the great king Tudkhalia IV campaigned against the Lukka people of the southwest. The Hittites subjugated this region, and, hypothetically, they may have driven some groups to flight, escaping destruction at home. Further north, Tudkhalia warred with a region called Achiyawa, that is, the Achaeans, in western Anatolia. Scholars can reconstruct that conflict from fragmentary texts and annals. Apparently, Tudkhalia attacked the Achiawans near Miletus, ancient Milawata, on the west coast. He subjugated that city and may have outright destroyed parts of it. The archaeological site of Miletus has a destruction layer dating to the late 13th century. Perhaps the Hittite attack drove the local Achaeans, or Ekwesh, from their homes, and they subsequently took to sailing. Thirdly, Tudkhalia had business in the northern part of Anatolia, when he intervened in the politics of Troy, or Wilusa. The Trojan king, named Walmu, had been deposed and needed Hittite help. Subsequently, the king of Hatti was able to restore him to his throne. This era of disruption and conflict might correlate with archaeological evidence at Troy itself. One layer of that city was destroyed violently in the late 13th century, apparently with remains of, quote, arrowheads embedded in the walls, and, quote, skeletons. We found, for example, a girl, 16, 17 years old, half buried, the feet burned by fire. It was a city which was besieged. I mentioned earlier how the Tursha, or Teresh, of Merneptah's record might, tentatively, be a version of Trojans. It's not hard to imagine refugees fleeing a burning kingdom, winding up on the sea, and ultimately in Egypt. Finally, Tudkhalia's forces themselves crossed the waters with warships of their own. In a daring escapade, the Hittites attacked the island of Cyprus sometime during this reign. Gathering a fleet, Tudkhalia's soldiers sailed against the Cypriot kingdom, called Alashia, and devastated it. A description of this event comes from the royal annals. Quote, I, Tudkhalia, seized the king of Alashia with his wives and his children. All the goods, including silver and gold, and all the captured people, I removed and brought home to Hattusa. I enslaved the country of Alashia and made it tributary on the spot." End quote. If even part of that is true, the Hittite attack may have been quite devastating, decapitating the leadership of the Alashia kingdom and removing a huge portion of its wealth. There is some archaeological evidence to support that. Coastal sites in Cyprus show evidence for destruction in the late 13th century, and also afterwards. Simultaneously, new centers appear on higher ground, as if locals were moving to more defensible positions. As usual, the extent of the damage varies by site, and the causes range from violent human attack to more natural phenomena. Cyprus has its own thing going on archaeologically, and to some extent they endured the late Bronze Age collapse better than other regions. But even if the Hittites did not fully destroy these communities, their raids would have been quite damaging, and certainly disruptive to trade in the region. Again, perhaps folks of the Aegean and Eastern Mediterranean took to their ships, heading offshore to escape the rampaging Hittites. Ironically, it may have been the Egyptians who gave the Hittites their tools for that attack. Back in the days of Ramesses II, episode 233, the Egyptians had given the king of Hatti ships. Not just ships, but ship builders, and blueprints for new vessels in the Egyptian style. The idea was to allow Hatti to build transport vessels for grain shipments that flowed between the Nile and Anatolia. I'm guessing Ramesses did not anticipate them using the vessels for war, but perhaps he should have. Like the eagle of Aesop, the Egyptians had given their allies new tools of destruction, tools that ultimately brought enemies to their own shores. All of this is to say that if scholars are correct in identifying an Aegean or Anatolian origin for some of the Sea Peoples groups, then the Hittites loom large in that scenario. The fact that Tudkhaliya IV, a contemporary of Merneptah, was active in both Western Anatolia and Cyprus might give some geopolitical context to these Sea Peoples movements. Even if he wasn't directly responsible for their raids, the pressures of conflict may have disrupted regional economies and communities. Like an international butterfly effect, damage in one center would push people out of another, and so forth, until groups packed up and headed overseas. If warrior elites were forced from their kingdoms or settled bases, they might turn to piracy, as the Lukka had done before. If they made a living traveling the sea lanes, like the Shekelesh, then attacks on Cyprus and Western Anatolia might have destroyed safe havens or pushed more folks onto the water. Ultimately, such disruptions may have pushed many peoples onto the seas to wind up on the shores of Egypt. Small groups compared to the Libu, and easily defeated by Pharaoh's warriors, but perhaps that was the point. Maybe, as Dr. Sameh Iskander puts it, Merneptah's Sea Peoples were less heavily armed invaders and more like fugitives. In 1221 BCE, a great battle took place in the western delta. Egyptians faced Libu, or Libyans, in large numbers in a bloody conflict. Simultaneously, the pharaoh Merneptah gives vague references to 5 more groups: Sherden, Lukka, Ekwesh, Tursha, and Shekelesh, who are traditionally referenced under the umbrella term Sea Peoples. Their role in this particular conflict is vague, thanks to damage on the hieroglyph texts, but enough details survive to give hints of their numbers, and scholars can speculate on their origins. In some cases, it seems plausible that certain tribes came from the Aegean or Anatolia. If so, they may have come to Egypt as raiders, immortalized in mythology, or perhaps fleeing upheavals in their homelands. Today, the picture of the Sea Peoples is ever evolving as historians re-examine old narratives, archaeologists uncover new material, and scholars generally reassess evidence from new angles. In the big picture, Merneptah's engagement was the third significant appearance of the Sea Peoples in Egyptian history. It was the largest so far, and perhaps the bloodiest. Remarkably though, the worst was yet to come. Thank you for listening to the History of Egypt podcast. This episode is slightly late, for which I apologize. About halfway through recording, I got hit by my own invader in the form of a summer cold, and my voice sounded garbage. Then the British heatwave took its toll, and I kept having insomnia, so things have just ground to a halt in the old brain case. We are back on track now, and I'll try to catch up on my release schedule. But to my supporters, thank you for your patience. Before I go, I'd like to extend my gratitude to everyone who supports the show on Patreon. It's my pleasure to welcome Not Sam to the ranks of the priesthood, our top-tier supporters. Thank you, Not Sam, although I'm wondering if that's a cunning ruse, and your name truly is Sam. Your generosity is most appreciated. To the other priests, thank you so much for your ongoing kindness. To Kate, Andy and Chelsea, Alicia, Erin, Farran, Dan, Si Yen, Karen, Chris, Veronica, Nadine, Eric, Mycost, Mallory, Suyon, Carlos, TJ, James B, Dan S, Jeffrey, Yola, Andrew, Terry, Erjan, and Linda. Folks, you are all most generous. To everyone listening, thank you so much for joining me. May Athena and Ares give you courage, but hopefully not encourage you to go raiding. And may Baal, the Storm Lord of Ugarit, ensure that you always have smooth sailings. I'll see you soon.